You never ignore a feral werewolf. Not when he stalks into your shop, dripping rain and radiating wild rage. Humans run from him. Other shifters bow to him. Me? I just wanted to finish my book. I assumed my total silence would make the grumpy warlord leave. I was wrong. Instead of walking out, the most dangerous predator in the territory reached across my counter, ripped out the best scene of my romance novel, and swallowed it whole. He wanted my undivided attention. He got a $40 invoice instead. Chapter 1. Rain battered the large front windows of the Verdant Heights bookstore. Ivy sat behind the thick oak counter, turning the crisp page of a paperback romance. A silver reading bookmark shaped like a feather rested near her elbow. Beside the register, Macaroni slept. The bright orange Persian cat possessed a flat face and a perpetual scowl, though right now his eyes remained shut in deep slumber. The brass bell above the front entrance chimed. A rush of cold wind swept into the shop, bringing a distinct fragrance of rain-soaked cedar. Through the doorway stalked a towering figure. He wore a tailored charcoal suit. Raindrops darkened the broad span of his shoulders. Messy dark brown hair clung to his forehead, framing a striking, sharp jawline. His intense amber eyes scanned the room, burning with wild, chaotic energy. Gideon, alpha of the Ironwood Pack, was having a terrible week. Border skirmishes kept his enforcers on edge. The sheer noise of his subordinates demanding his attention drove him out of his own compound. He needed silence. He needed to escape the crushing burden of leadership. He marched toward the center of the room. His inner beast thrashed against his ribs, restless and volatile. He let out a low, vibrating growl, pushing his heavy alpha presence outward. The oppressive force rippled through the air, designed to clear the room of any lesser predators or humans. Ivy did not flinch. As an Omega, she carried a natural, grounding aura. The oppressive weight of his command washed over her skin and vanished, neutralized by her inherent calm. She reached up, adjusting the practical clip holding her honey-blonde hair in place. She kept her bright hazel eyes focused on paragraph 4 of her novel. I survived the worst pack politics this state has to offer. A grumpy man in a wetsuit does not intimidate me. Gideon stopped in front of the counter. He expected submission. He expected her to cower or run out the back door. Instead, she traced her finger down the page, absorbed in the fiction. His inner wolf paced in his mind, agitated by her indifference. "She ignores us," the beast rumbled, its distinct, booming voice echoing in Gideon's skull. "Make her submit. Demand her attention." Gideon clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to snap at the voice in his head. He placed his large hands flat on the oak surface. The heavy steel pack ring on his right index finger, bearing a pine tree crest, clinked against the wood. "The shop is closed," Gideon commanded, his tone rough. Ivy lifted her gaze. She took in his tense posture and the feral spark in his eyes. She picked up her pen, tapping the plastic casing against her chin in a steady, calculated rhythm. She pointed the tip of the pen toward a small chalkboard sign resting near the register. The chalk letters read, "No growling before coffee." "I close at 8, Ivy corrected. She smoothed the sleeve of her soft cream cardigan. "And you are dripping water on my floorboards. I require an apology, or I require you to leave." Gideon stared at her. The sheer audacity of her demand short-circuited his brain. His feral instinct spiked, a childish, chaotic tantrum rising in his chest. He commanded lethal fighters. He dictated the laws of the territory. He refused to be dismissed by a stubborn woman in practical, stylish flats. "Look at us," his inner wolf demanded, the beast pressing against the forefront of his mind. "Take the book. Destroy the distraction." Gideon surrendered to the impulse. He reached across the counter. His speed defied human sight. He snatched the paperback from her hands before she could register the movement. Ivy gasped in outrage. "Give that back!" Gideon held her gaze, his amber eyes flashing with defiant triumph. He gripped the top corner of the page she was reading. With a harsh, deliberate yank, he ripped the entire chunk of Chapter 7 out of the binding. He crumpled the wad of paper, shoved it into his mouth, and chewed. Ty sat frozen in shock. She watched the lethal alpha swallow the fictional romance scene. He swallowed hard, his throat working the dry paper down. "Pay attention to me," Gideon stated, his voice a dark, unyielding promise. Ivy exhaled a sharp breath. She set her pen down, reached under the counter, and pulled out a brass-cornered shop ledger. She flipped it open to a blank page. She grabbed her pen and scribbled a swift line of text. She tore the invoice from the book and slid it across the oak counter. "A $40 inconvenience fee," Ivy announced, her tone polite but firm. "Cash or card?" Chapter 2. Gideon stared at the small slip of paper resting on the counter. The neat, precise handwriting demanded a $40 inconvenience fee for her ruined afternoon. The taste of dry ink and cheap paper lingered on his tongue. He looked up from the invoice. Ivy sat across from him, her posture rigid, waiting for his compliance. She showed zero trace of fear. Her hazel eyes burned with righteous indignation. The feral agitation in Gideon's chest faltered. The crushing pressure of his alpha duties, the endless border disputes, and the constant noise of his enforcers began to recede. Standing in this small, quiet space, bathed in her natural omega aura, the storm inside his mind quieted. The beast stopped pacing. "She is strong," his inner wolf noted, the booming voice dropping to a curious hum. "She does not break. Claim the mate. Keep her." Gideon ignored the beast, but a strange sense of amusement sparked in his chest. He spent his entire adult life surrounded by individuals who bent to his will the moment he entered a room. He craved a true partner who saw him as just a man, not an untouchable boss. This infuriating, brave bookstore owner treated him like a nuisance, and he found the experience intoxicating. "If I push her any further, she will banish me from this sanctuary, and I refuse to lose the only quiet place in this territory." Gideon reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He retrieved a sleek leather wallet and pulled out a crisp $50 bill. He placed the currency next to the handwritten invoice. "Keep the change," Gideon offered, his cranky exterior cracking to reveal a lively, teasing spark. Ivy picked up the bill. She opened her register, placed the money inside, and pulled out a $10 note. She slid the change back across the counter, refusing his extra offering. "I run a legitimate business," Ivy stated, pushing the brass-cornered ledger aside. "I demand strict accountability. I do not accept hush money for dramatic tantrums. Take your change." Gideon picked up the $10 bill. He rolled his broad shoulders backward, easing the tension from his muscles. The wet fabric of his charcoal suit clung to his frame, a reminder of the storm raging outside. He tucked the money into his pocket. Macaroni, the Persian cat, let out a loud, disgruntled meow. The feline stood up on the stack of hardcovers, stretching his back. He glared at Gideon with a harsh, judgmental stare, unimpressed by the alpha's presence. "You owe my cat an apology too," Ivy noted. "You disturbed his nap." Gideon looked at the orange feline. He tilted his head, acknowledging the animal's irritation. "My apologies to the beast." He turned his attention back to Ivy. Her honey-blonde hair caught the warm, yellow light of the overhead lamps. He committed the curve of her jaw and the stubborn set of her shoulders to memory. He found the missing piece of his chaotic life, hidden behind a checkout counter in Verdant Heights. "I will replace the book," Gideon promised. "I expect a brand new copy by Friday," Ivy countered, "or I will add late fees to your next invoice." Gideon let out a rough, breathy laugh. The sound surprised him. He could not remember the last time he laughed. He offered a respectful nod, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door, stepping back into the cold rain. He climbed into his midnight blue Aston Martin SUV parked on the street. He gripped the leather steering wheel, savoring the residual calm washing over his senses. The feral urge to snap and bite vanished, replaced by a singular, unyielding focus. His inner wolf let out a satisfied rumble. "We return tomorrow. Bring offerings. Court the Omega." Gideon started the engine. He put the vehicle in drive and navigated the wet streets toward the Ironwood compound. He faced a night of tedious strategy meetings and logistics reports, but the burden felt lighter. He found an anchor. He planned to return to that shop every single day until the fierce bookstore owner surrendered her guarded heart. Chapter 3. The bell above the bookstore entrance chimed, signaling another arrival. Gideon pushed the door open, stepping out of the midday sun. He traded his formal suit for a simple black Henley shirt and dark denim, attempting to blend into the quiet atmosphere of the shop. He sought refuge. His beta, Lucian, possessed a relentless, organized mind. Lucian spent the entire morning demanding Gideon review structural repair quotes and border patrol schedules. Gideon reached his limit. He abandoned his second-in-command in the middle of a sentence, seeking the one place his beast felt calm. Ivy stood near a towering wooden shelf in the fiction section, organizing a stack of new arrivals. She wore comfortable loafers and a slate-gray cardigan. She glanced over her shoulder, spotting his entrance. "You are back," Ivy observed, her tone neutral. "Did you run out of reading material to eat?" "I require a sanctuary," Gideon admitted. He walked toward a plush, oversized armchair nestled in the corner of the room. "My beta is a relentless tyrant with a clipboard. Give me 1 hour of peace." Ivy turned back to her books. "The reading chairs are for paying customers. Buy a coffee." Gideon pulled out his wallet, walked to the counter, and deposited a $5 bill. He returned to the armchair and sank into the cushions. He let out a long breath, stretching his long legs out in front of him. The quiet ambiance of the shop worked its magic, untangling the knots in his spine. A heavy weight landed on his thigh. Gideon opened his eyes. Macaroni the Persian cat sat dead center on his lap. The bright orange feline kneaded his claws into Gideon's denim jeans, turned in a tight circle, and flopped onto his side. The cat rested his flat, scowling face against Gideon's stomach and began to purr. Gideon stiffened. He disliked animals that defied his authority. He pushed a fraction of his alpha presence toward the cat, a silent command to move. Macaroni ignored the command. The feline stretched a fluffy paw upward, resting it against Gideon's chest. His inner wolf let out an impatient huff. "The small beast claims us. Endure it. Show the mate we are gentle providers." "I am a lethal apex predator, yet I am trapped under 10 pounds of orange fur." Ivy walked past the armchair carrying an empty cardboard box. She stopped, taking in the bizarre scene. Her bright hazel eyes widened in surprise. A genuine, unguarded smile broke across her face. "He likes you," Ivy noted. "He usually hisses at strangers." "He is holding me hostage," Gideon corrected, keeping his hands raised in surrender. Ivy let out a bright, melodic laugh. The sound sent a jolt of pure electricity straight to Gideon's chest. He felt an intense, possessive urge to protect that smile at all costs. He wanted to hear it every day for the rest of his life. The front door of the shop swung shut as a customer exited. The hinges let out a loud, piercing squeak that echoed through the quiet room. Ivy sighed, her smile fading. "I need to call the handyman again. That sound is driving me insane." Gideon looked at the heavy wooden door. He shifted his weight, careful not to disturb the sleeping cat on his lap. "Do you have a toolbox?" Ivy blinked, confused by the offer. "In the back room." "Why?" "Bring it to me," Gideon requested. Ivy set the cardboard box down. She retrieved a small plastic toolbox from the storage area and set it on the floor next to his chair. Gideon scooped Macaroni into his arms, ignoring the cat's indignant yowl of protest. He deposited the feline onto the seat cushion. He grabbed a screwdriver and a can of lubricating oil from the kit. He spent the next 15 minutes working on the door. He tightened the loose screws, adjusted the alignment of the heavy wood, and applied the oil to the metal joints. He opened and closed the door 3 times. It swung shut in perfect silence. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, returning the tools to the kit. Ivy watched him, her arms crossed over her chest. The fierce independence she projected faltered, replaced by quiet appreciation. Her former alpha viewed manual labor as beneath his rank. Gideon, a fearsome warlord, fixed a squeaky hinge just to spare her a headache. "Thank you," Ivy said, her voice soft. Gideon held her gaze, offering a sharp, teasing grin. "Add it to my tab." Chapter 4. Ivy navigated her pastel lavender Mini Cooper up the winding, forested road leading to the Ironwood compound. The trunk of her small vehicle held 4 heavy boxes of textbooks, a special bulk order requested by the pack school. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale. She hated crossing into active pack territory. The sheer concentration of aggressive predators brought back suffocating memories of her past. She built a life in Verdant Heights to escape pack hierarchy. Now, her business obligations pulled her straight back into the lion's den. She parked near the grand, rustic loading dock of the main house. She killed the engine, stepped out of the car, and opened the rear hatch. She grabbed the first cardboard box, her athletic curves straining under the heavy weight of the hardcover books. "Look what wandered into the yard," a rough voice called out. Ivy turned. 3 bulky enforcers stood near the loading ramp. They wore dark tactical gear, their arms crossed over their broad chests. They projected hostile, territorial energy, smelling her omega nature from across the pavement. "Are you lost, little human lover?" the tallest enforcer mocked. He took a step forward, his combat boots scraping against the concrete. "We do not need weak omegas dropping trash on our porch. Scurry back to your shop." Ivy planted her feet. She refused to cower. She adjusted her grip on the heavy box, tilting her chin up to meet his hostile glare. "I am not a fragile victim, and I will not let a low-ranking thug speak to me like a stray dog." "I am fulfilling a contracted order," Ivy stated, her voice steady and polite. "I demand strict accountability from my clients, and I expect basic manners in return. Move out of my way." The enforcer sneered, baring a set of sharp teeth. He reached out to slap the box from her hands. Before his fingers could make contact, a terrifying heavy force slammed into the loading dock. The air pressure dropped. The sheer weight of an unyielding alpha command hit the 3 enforcers, forcing them straight to their knees. Gideon strode out of the main house doors. He wore a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The lively, teasing man from the bookstore vanished. Pure, brutal violence radiated from his amber eyes. "Stand down," Gideon ordered. His voice carried a dark, lethal resonance that vibrated through the concrete. The 3 enforcers pressed their foreheads to the ground, offering total submission to their leader. They shook under the weight of his anger. Gideon stopped beside Ivy. He kept himself positioned between her and his men, acting as a steady shield. He did not yell. The quiet intensity of his rage proved far more terrifying than a shout. "She is an honored guest of this territory," Gideon addressed the kneeling wolves. "She holds my unwavering protection. You will treat her with the reverence of a Luna, or I will strip your ranks and banish you from my lands. Do you understand?" "Yes, Alpha," the enforcers choked out in unison. "Take these boxes to the schoolhouse," Gideon commanded, "then report to the Gamma for disciplinary lapse." The enforcers scrambled to their feet. They grabbed the heavy cardboard boxes from the back of the Mini Cooper, avoiding eye contact with Ivy, and hurried away toward the educational wing of the compound. Ivy stood near the bumper of her car, her heart racing. She watched the fierce alpha handle the threat with cold, calculated justice. Her ex used his enforcers to intimidate her. Gideon disciplined his strongest fighters to protect her pride. His inner wolf paced, a frantic edge in its mental voice. "They insulted the mate. We should have broken their bones." Gideon clamped down on the violent urge. He turned to face Ivy, the lethal warlord facade melting away. He shoved his hands into his pockets, suddenly looking endearingly shy. My apologies for their behavior, Gideon offered. They forget their manners when dealing with outsiders. Ivy reached up, tapping her chin with her index finger. The shock of the confrontation faded, replaced by genuine warmth. She saw the man beneath the imposing title. You handled it. Thank you. Gideon offered a small, hesitant smile. Since you completed your delivery, let me buy you a coffee in town. A peace offering. Ivy looked at his striking features, the walls around her hidden loneliness cracking just a fraction. I know a great cafe. Follow me. Chapter 5. The afternoon lull settled over the Bookstore cafe. Ivy stood behind the polished espresso machine, wiping down the stainless steel drip tray. She set 2 ceramic mugs on a wooden serving tray and walked toward a quiet corner booth. Gideon occupied the seat facing the front window. He took up an unfair amount of space, his long legs stretched out under the table. Ivy set a mug of dark roast in front of him. She took the opposite seat, wrapping her hands around her own steaming cup. You spend a lot of time avoiding your territory, Ivy observed, taking a sip of the bitter brew. Gideon picked up his coffee. He bypassed the handle, wrapping his large hand directly around the scalding ceramic. My territory requires constant vigilance. This corner booth requires nothing. He studied her over the rim of his mug. The cranky, overburdened leader from their first encounter had vanished. In his place sat an intuitive, observant man. You run a successful business, Gideon noted, setting his drink down. You negotiate contracts and manage logistics, yet you operate a dozen miles away from the nearest pack boundary. Omegas thrive on community bonds. Why isolate yourself? Ivy traced her thumb over the rim of her cup. She usually deflected personal questions, preferring to keep her past locked behind polite customer service. But the imposing alpha across from her had fixed her door and disciplined his own soldiers to protect her pride. He earned a measure of truth. I belonged to the Silver Creek Pack, Ivy explained, keeping her voice even. I had an alpha. We built a life together. I spent 3 years organizing their community outreach, balancing their ledgers, and acting as his anchor. Gideon went very still. The relaxed posture disappeared, replaced by sharp, focused attention. Then the neighboring territory offered a land treaty, Ivy continued. She looked out the window, watching a pedestrian hurry past the glass. The treaty required a political marriage. My alpha needed the land to expand his borders. He broke our bond the next morning. He told me I was a wonderful asset, but an Omega could never secure a military alliance. I built my armor to withstand aggression, but recalling the casual cruelty of his ambitions still steals the breath from my lungs. Ivy brought her gaze back to the table. She expected Gideon to defend the choice. Pack leaders prioritized survival above all else. They viewed political strategy as a necessary burden. She braced herself for the inevitable lecture on werewolf duty and territorial expansion. Instead, Gideon stared at her, his expression hardening into cold, uncompromising anger. He did not yell. He did not project his heavy presence. He was a coward, Gideon stated. The words rang with undeniable conviction. A title does not forge a leader. A true leader builds their territory with their own 2 hands. He traded his most valuable partner for dirt and grass because he lacked the strength to defend it himself. Ivy exhaled a shaky breath. The quiet validation dismantled a wall she had spent years building. He offered no excuses for his kind. He did not dismiss her pain as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. He sat across from her and condemned the betrayal without hesitation. I left Silver Creek that afternoon, Ivy said, her tone lighter. I moved to Verdant Heights. I opened this shop. I swore I would never rely on a pack hierarchy for my survival again. A smart strategy, Gideon agreed. He picked up his mug, the anger fading into a steady, respectful calm. You built an empire. You demand accountability. You require an equal. Ivy offered him a small, knowing nod. They spent the next hour discussing business margins and favorite novels. The conversation flowed with an easy, engaging rhythm. For the first time since she arrived in the human town, the quiet ache of her hidden loneliness began to recede, replaced by the steadfast presence of the warlord sitting across her table. Chapter 6. The Ironwood compound boardroom felt like a prison cell. Gideon sat at the head of the long conference table, staring at a projected map of the eastern perimeter. Lucian stood near the screen, holding a clipboard and droning on about fence repairs and security shifts. Gideon pressed his fingertips to his temples. He tried to focus on the Beta's logistics report. Instead, his mind hosted a chaotic, relentless argument. "The meeting is a waste of time," his inner wolf boomed, the distinct voice vibrating in Gideon's skull. "The Omega is alone. She requires a provider. Go to the forest, hunt a rabbit, drop the fresh kill on her counter." Gideon clenched his teeth. He kept his face blank, staring at the map. He refused to answer the beast out loud. "We do not hunt rabbits for modern women," Gideon argued silently, communicating with his second personality through thought alone. "She owns a cafe. She eats pastries." "A stag, then," the wolf insisted, pacing in a frantic circle within their shared consciousness. "Hunt a stag, bring the antlers, show her we are the strongest predator in the valley, claim the mate." "She is not a feral beast," Gideon countered. "She wants conversation and coffee." "Conversation does not prove dominance," the wolf growled. "Tear out the throat of a rival, drop it at her feet. She will understand the gesture." "I govern hundreds of lethal fighters and negotiate complex territorial treaties, yet my own mind acts like a lovesick, primitive pup." "Are you listening, Alpha?" Lucian asked. Gideon dropped his hands from his face. The Beta stood at the end of the table, peering over his wire-rimmed glasses. 3 other subordinates sat along the sides of the room, waiting for a command. "Repeat the supply line issue," Gideon ordered. "The lumber delivery for the Eastern Watchtower is delayed," Lucian stated, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "The vendor claims bad weather ruined the access road. We have a $3,000 deficit in our defensive budget." The wolf snarled. "The Beta talks too much. Bite his arm, leave this place, go to the Omega." Gideon pushed his chair back. The wood scraped against the floorboards. The sudden movement caused the subordinates to stiffen, sensing the restless, volatile energy radiating from their leader. "Reallocate the funds from the vehicle maintenance account," Gideon instructed. He stood up, towering over the table. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. "Send a secondary crew to clear the mud from the access road. Do not wait for the vendor." Lucian raised an eyebrow. The Beta knew Gideon better than anyone in the territory. He recognized the shift in his leader's demeanor. The irritable leader was retreating, making way for a distracted, impatient man. "Are we adjourning early?" Lucian questioned. "The logistics are handled," Gideon dismissed. He walked toward the exit, ignoring the surprised looks from his men. "I have off-site business." "Does this business involve the human town and a specific coffee tab?" Lucian teased, a dry smirk touching his lips. Gideon did not answer. He strode down the hallway, leaving the tedious pack politics behind. The heavy burden of his rank lifted with every step he took toward the parking lot. He climbed into his vehicle and started the engine. He had no intention of hunting a stag, but he intended to spend the rest of the afternoon sitting in a quiet corner booth, listening to an Omega talk about her day. Chapter 7. Cardboard boxes littered the floor of the bookstore's back storage room. Ivy stood on a short stepladder, sliding heavy biographies onto the top shelf. Gideon stood below her, slicing through packing tape with a steel pocket knife. They operated in a seamless, unspoken rhythm. Gideon opened a box, pulled out a stack of hardcovers, and handed them up. Ivy took the books, aligned them on the wood, and reached down for the next batch. The physical labor kept them moving in a synchronized dance. In the corner of the room, the bright orange cat slept inside an empty cardboard box. The feline curled into a tight ball, ignoring the surrounding activity. Gideon handed up the last 3 books from the current pile. Ivy grabbed them, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact sent a jolt of heat up her arm. She placed the books on the shelf and stepped down from the ladder. "That is the last of the history section," Ivy announced, wiping dust from her hands. "I owe you a free pastry for the manual labor." "I accept payment in dark roast," Gideon countered, folding his pocket knife and slipping it away. The brass bell at the front of the shop chimed. Heavy, purposeful footsteps crossed the hardwood floor, bypassing the cafe tables and heading straight for the storage room. Ivy turned. Lucian appeared in the doorway. The beta wore a dark jacket, his expression stripped of its usual sarcasm. He did not look at Ivy. He focused on his alpha. "We have a problem," Lucian reported, his tone rigid. The change in Gideon was instantaneous. The relaxed, helpful companion vanished. His posture straightened, his broad shoulders locking into a rigid, imposing stance. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop. His amber eyes hardened into unyielding chips of ice. "Report," Gideon commanded, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. "Scouts found fresh tracks along the river," Lucian stated. 5 wolves. They crossed the boundary line before dawn. They left a marker." Gideon clenched his jaw. The feral spark ignited, burning away his humanity. He transformed into a warlord preparing for a siege. "Darius. The shattered bone pack is probing our defenses," Lucian confirmed. Ivy took a step back, bumping against the wooden shelving unit. The air in the room felt thick and heavy. She spent the last several days watching Gideon fix doors and drink coffee. She forgot the reality of his existence. He was the apex predator of a violent world. The stark transition from a gentle companion to a ruthless leader sends a shiver straight down my spine. Gideon turned his head, his piercing gaze locking onto Ivy. The intensity of his focus made her heart race. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Lock the front entrance," Gideon instructed, his voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. "Drop the deadbolts on the back door. Do not walk to your car alone tonight. I will send a guard to escort you when you close the shop." "I do not need a babysitter," Ivy argued, her independence flaring up despite the tension. "This is not a negotiation," Gideon stated, leaving no room for defiance. He did not use his alpha command, but the raw plea in his eyes silenced her protest. "Darius plays a dirty game. Keep the doors locked." He did not wait for her agreement. Gideon spun around and marched out of the storage room, Lucian trailing right behind him. The brass bell chimed a final time, leaving Ivy standing in the quiet dust of the back room, a sudden spike of dread settling in her chest. Chapter 8. The rushing water of the river drowned out the ambient noise of the forest. Gideon stood on the muddy bank, surrounded by 4 of his toughest enforcers. The cold evening air bit at their exposed skin, but the heat of their blood kept the chill at bay. Gideon crouched in the damp earth. Deep, erratic claw marks tore through the mud, leading across the shallow water toward the shattered bone territory. Darius sent his scouts over the line, a blatant act of disrespect. "They moved fast," one of the enforcers noted, scanning the dark tree line. "They wanted us to find the trail," Gideon corrected, his voice a low rumble. He stood up and walked toward the base of a towering oak tree near the water's edge. He spotted a strange disturbance in the dead leaves. He pulled a thick leather tactical glove from his pocket and slid it over his right hand. Gideon reached down and brushed the foliage aside. A heavy steel trap rested in the dirt. The jagged, mechanical jaws gleamed with an unnatural, pristine shine. It was a custom rig, plated in solid silver. His inner wolf snarled, a vicious sound of pure hatred. "Poison. The enemy brings poison to our home. Tear their throats out." Gideon picked up a thick, fallen branch. He shoved the branch into the center of the trap. The silver-plated jaws snapped shut with brutal force, snapping the thick timber like a dry twig. If a patrolling wolf stepped on that trigger, the heavy mechanism would shatter their bone, and the silver plating would burn straight through the muscle, paralyzing the limb with toxic agony. Darius was not just probing the borders, he was staging a lethal war. Gideon pulled the leather glove off and shoved it into his pocket. He turned to face his enforcers. Establish a 2-mile buffer zone along this river. Nobody patrols alone. If a shattered bone wolf crosses the water, break their legs and drag them to the holding cells. The enforcers offered sharp nods, fanning out to execute the orders. Gideon stood alone by the ruined trap. The tactical implications raced through his mind. Darius utilized fear and intimidation to expand his lands. He hunted for weaknesses, targeting the vulnerable members of a rival pack to force a surrender. His wolf paced in a frantic, tight circle within his consciousness. The Omega. She is in the human town. She has no pack. Darius will smell our attachment. He will hunt the mate. My enemies search for cracks in my armor, unaware I left my heart unguarded behind a bookstore counter. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced Gideon's chest. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit a speed dial number. Lucian answered on the first ring. Deploy a shadow detail to Verdant Heights, Gideon ordered, marching away from the riverbank. I want 2 men on the roof of the bookstore. I want a vehicle tracking her commute. They stay out of sight, and they do not interfere with her business, but if a rogue steps foot on her street, I want them executed. Understood, Lucian replied over the line. Where are you going? I am securing the target, Gideon stated. He hung up the phone and broke into a run. He pushed his human body to the limit, his muscles burning as he sprinted through the dense forest toward his parked vehicle. The border dispute no longer mattered. The politics of the pack fell away. The feral warlord possessed a singular, driving focus. Reach the bookstore before the enemy realized what he had to lose. Chapter 9. The deadbolts on the bookstore's front entrance clicked shut, echoing through the empty room. Ivy flipped the closed sign, marking the end of her shift. Outside, the streetlights illuminated the wet pavement. She walked toward the back storage room, eager to tally the day's receipts, when a heavy, rhythmic knock rattled the front glass. She turned around. A tall silhouette blocked the glow of the street lamp. Ivy approached the door, peering through the glass pane. Gideon stood on the welcome mat. Mud caked the knees of his dark trousers, and a jagged tear ruined the sleeve of his dark jacket. He looked exhausted, his broad frame leaning against the doorframe for support. She unlocked the mechanism and pulled the door open. You look like you wrestled a thorny thicket and lost, Ivy noted, stepping aside to let him enter. Gideon walked inside, bringing the chill of the night with him. He bypassed the cafe tables and headed straight for the small 2-seater sofa in her back office. He sank into the cushions, resting his forearms on his knees. The forest fought back, Gideon admitted, his voice a low, rough rasp. His inner wolf paced within his mind, the chaotic energy settling into a steady, rhythmic hum. We reached the den. The Omega is here. Rest the bones. Ivy locked the door again and followed him into the back office. The overhead light revealed a fresh, bleeding scratch trailing down his exposed forearm, visible through the torn fabric of his jacket. She did not ask questions about pack politics or border wars. She walked to her supply closet, retrieving a white plastic first aid kit. She took a seat next to him on the small sofa. The space felt cramped, their knees brushing. She opened the kit, pulled out an alcohol swab, and tore the foil wrapper. Hold still, Ivy instructed. Gideon lifted his arm, offering the injury to her care. He watched her face as she leaned in. She dabbed the stinging alcohol against the cut. Her touch was firm, focused, and steady. The proximity overwhelmed his heightened senses. He dictated the survival of an entire territory, yet sitting this close to her made his heart hammer against his ribs in an uneven cadence. He stared at her, cataloging the intense concentration knitting her brow. He lost his words. The usual teasing banter vanished, leaving a heavy, aching silence in its wake. I should be planning a counteroffensive against my enemies, but sitting in this cramped room and listening to her breathe is the only thing keeping my sanity intact. Ivy pulled the swab away and inspected her work. She tossed the ruined square into a nearby trash bin. She noticed his silence. She caught him staring, a raw, undeniable vulnerability etched into his strong features. A blush crept up her neck, warming her skin. "You have access to skilled pack healers," Ivy pointed out, her voice dropping to a muted whisper. "Why come here?" Gideon leaned back against the sofa cushions, letting out a ragged sigh. "Because out there I am a shield. I must project an unbreakable facade. If I show fatigue, my enemies strike. If I show hesitation, my fighters panic." He turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers. "This office is the only place my beast and I feel calm." Ivy broke the eye contact, flustered by the sheer honesty of his confession. She snapped the first aid kit shut, setting it on the floor. She offered no pity, knowing a warlord despised sympathy. Instead, she stood up, walked to the espresso machine, and poured him a fresh mug of dark roast coffee. She handed him the steaming ceramic cup, offering him the quiet safety of her domain to weather the storm. Chapter 10. Morning sunlight poured through the front windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Ivy stood behind the checkout counter, staring at the illuminated screen of her tablet. She read the email a second time, her knuckles turning stark white as she gripped the device. The brass bell chimed. Gideon strode into the shop, carrying a cardboard tray with 2 to-go cups of premium coffee. He stopped, noticing her rigid posture and the sharp glare directed at her screen. "I brought fuel," Gideon offered, setting the tray on the counter. Ivy set her tablet down with a sharp clack. "The municipal council just approved my bid to supply the local library network for the next 3 years. It is a $20,000 contract." "Congratulations," Gideon stated. He picked up his cup, taking a slow sip. "Your inventory catalog speaks for itself." "Do not lie to me," Ivy challenged, her tone laced with sharp accusation. She planted her hands on the counter. "The Ironwood Pack holds significant influence over the municipal council. I demand strict accountability. I told you I want to build a self-sustaining business. I refuse to accept charity or manipulated favors." Gideon lowered his coffee. His inner wolf bristled at her aggressive tone. "She questions our honor," the beast growled, its voice vibrating with indignation. "Show her the truth. Prove our worth." Gideon pushed the beast down, keeping his expression neutral. He refused to escalate the argument. He walked around the counter, stepping into her space. He leaned his hip against the oak surface, looking down at her. "I govern a territory of lethal predators, yet this fierce entrepreneur interrogating me over a library contract is the most terrifying interrogation I have ever faced." "I made a single phone call to the council president," Gideon explained, his voice even and calm. "I told him to review your website and your projected margins. That is the extent of my interference." Ivy studied his face, searching for deception. "The council requested the wholesale numbers you provided last quarter," Gideon continued. "They reviewed your delivery logistics. They awarded the bid because you run a ruthless, efficient operation. I opened the door. You built the house." The tension drained from Ivy's shoulders, leaving behind a rush of deep relief. Her former partner used his influence to control her, dangling favors to ensure her compliance. Gideon used his influence to clear a path, stepping aside to let her shine. She picked up her coffee from the cardboard tray. The warm paper sleeve grounded her. She took a slow drink, the bitter roast settling her nerves. $20,000, Ivy murmured, the reality of the business milestone settling into her bones. "A solid victory," Gideon agreed. Ivy looked up at him. A slow, breathtaking curve of her lips transformed her expression, chasing the shadows from her eyes. The sight of that bright, unclouded happiness stole the breath from Gideon's lungs. The looming threat of border wars and rival factions vanished, eclipsed by the brilliant pride radiating from the woman standing beside him. Chapter 11. Midnight draped a quiet stillness over the bookstore. Cardboard boxes formed a small labyrinth on the main floor. The impending community book drive required sorting 300 donated volumes by genre, and the deadline approached with ruthless speed. Gideon sat cross-legged on the rug, surrounded by stacks of hardcovers. He traded his jacket for a simple white undershirt, the fabric pulled tight across his chest. He grabbed a stack of mystery novels and placed them into a designated crate. Across from him, Ivy checked titles off a digital manifest. Exhaustion blurred the edges of the room. They worked in a synchronized rhythm, passing books back and forth in comfortable silence. The barrier between shifter and human wore thin under the late hour. Gideon reached for another stack. As his arm extended, his shirt shifted, revealing a thick, jagged expanse of scarred tissue tracking across his collarbone and disappearing beneath the fabric. Ivy paused, her pen hovering over her tablet. She stared at the old wound. It did not look like a neat surgical cut. It looked like the result of a brutal, frenzied attack. "Take a break," Ivy instructed, setting her device aside. "You have been lifting crates for 3 hours." Gideon rested his hands on his knees. "My stamina is fine. The pack survived worse than a book drive." "You carry a heavy burden for them," Ivy observed, pulling her knees to her chest. "Were you born into the leadership role, or did you fight for it?" Gideon went rigid. The question struck a nerve he rarely allowed anyone to access. His inner wolf released a low, distressed whimper, a rare sound of sorrow. "Hide the pain," the beast urged. "Do not speak of the blood." Gideon ignored the wolf. He looked at the dim streetlights outside the window, his jaw tight. "My father held the title before me. A rival faction ambushed him during a peace summit when I was 20. They slaughtered his guards. They tore him apart." Ivy stopped breathing. The violent reality of his world crashed through her safe, organized bubble. "I took the mantle the following morning," Gideon continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "I buried my father, hunted down the rival insurgents, and executed their leader. I buried my youth to keep my people alive. I have been fighting a war ever since." He expects me to recoil from the violence of his past, but his tragic history only deepens my respect for the man he became. Ivy uncurled her legs and crawled across the rug, bridging the distance between them. She offered no hollow apologies or generic sympathies. She reached out, pressing her palm flat against his chest, right over the hidden expanse of scarred tissue. Gideon looked down at her hand. The warmth of her skin anchored him to the present moment, chasing away the ghosts of his youth. He turned his arm, catching her fingers in his own, holding on to her grip like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. They sat on the floor, surrounded by cardboard crates, finding a quiet, grounding solace in the dark. Chapter 12. The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete sidewalks of the town square. Ivy pushed a metal dolly loaded with surplus inventory toward her vehicle. Gideon walked beside her, carrying a tall stack of broken-down cardboard boxes with effortless grace. Across the street, concealed within the deep shadows of a brick alleyway, Darius watched them. The leader of the shattered bone pack gripped the edge of a brick wall. The ruined tissue on the side of his face stretched tight into a cruel smile. He watched the Ironwood warlord, a man feared across the region, carrying recycling for an omega. "The great leader guards a fragile bird," Darius muttered to himself, his voice scraping like gravel. "I will snap its wings." Darius signaled with a flick of his wrist. A young, wiry scout stepped out of the darkness behind him. Darius pointed a clawed finger at Ivy's vehicle. "Follow the car. Find out where she sleeps. Do not engage, just observe." The scout offered a swift nod, slipping into the crowded pedestrian traffic and vanishing from sight. On the other side of the street, Gideon stopped in his tracks. His inner wolf unleashed a thunderous roar, a sound of pure violence echoing in Gideon's skull. "Enemy! Blood and teeth! Protect the mate!" Gideon dropped the cardboard boxes onto the pavement. "Darius thinks he found my weakness, but he just signed his own death warrant." He spun around, scanning the busy square. Shoppers parted around him, primitive instinct forcing them away from the apex predator standing in their path. Gideon pushed his heightened senses outward, cutting through the noise of the city. He tasted hostile intent lingering in the air, a dark stain against the normal chaos of the district. "What is wrong?" Ivy asked, letting go of the metal dolly. Gideon grabbed her elbow, pulling her flush against his side. He shielded her body with his own, his gaze locked on the distant alleyway. "Get in the car. Lock the doors." Ivy did not argue. The lethal, calculating focus in his gaze warned her of immediate, unyielding danger. She slid into the driver's seat and hit the locks. Gideon pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing his second-in-command. Lucian answered on the first ring. "They are in the town square," Gideon ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Darius sent a tail. "Double the shadow detail on her shop. Put snipers on the roof of her apartment building. If a shattered bone rogue steps onto her street, end them." Gideon hung up the phone. He glared across the street. The shadows were empty, but the threat remained real. The enemy found his weak point, and the shadow of war just dropped over verdant heights. Chapter 13. Morning sunlight cut through the overcast sky above verdant heights. Ivy parked her compact vehicle in the designated spot behind the bookstore. She killed the engine and gripped the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, a black sedan idled at the end of the alley. Two men sat in the front seats. The driver wore a dark jacket bearing the ironwood crest on the collar. A cold spike of anger pierced her chest. She recognized the vehicle. It trailed her from her apartment building. It followed her through the morning traffic. Gideon placed a shadow detail on her. Ivy grabbed her keys, shoved her car door open, and marched toward the back entrance of her office. She unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the heavy wood wide. Inside, Macaroni lay stretched out on her desk, batting a stray pen across the surface. Gideon stood by the filing cabinet, holding a fresh cup of coffee. He wore a simple gray sweater, his broad frame dominating the small room. "You put a tail on me," Ivy stated. She dropped her keys onto the counter. Gideon lowered his cup. He met her gaze with steady focus. "I assigned enforcers to watch your locations." "Call them off," Ivy demanded. She closed the distance between them, refusing to back down. "My ex used guards to monitor my movements. He called it protection, but it operated as a cage. I demand strict boundaries. I refuse to be managed. I escaped one prison, and I refuse to let another alpha build a new cage around me." Gideon set the coffee on top of the cabinet. He stepped forward. He did not issue an alpha command. He kept his hands at his sides, offering no intimidation. His inner wolf paced, frantic and protective. "Bite the threats," the beast ordered. "Tear the rival apart. Lock the mate in the den." Gideon clenched his jaw, forcing the beast into submission. He focused on the woman standing before him. "I am not your ex," Gideon said. His voice rumbled, low and calm. "I am not tracking you to dictate your life. Darius sent a scout to follow you yesterday. He identified you as my vulnerability. He intends to use you to break my pack." Ivy stopped. The anger faded, replaced by a sudden, chilling reality. "The Shattered Bone Leader knows who I am?" "He knows you matter to me," Gideon corrected. "He knows I left the border to come to your shop. My enemies strike where my armor is weakest. Right now, that is you, standing in this city without a pack to defend you." Ivy looked at his face. The exhaustion bracketing his features served as a harsh reminder of his violent reality. He did not order her compliance. He laid out the facts and gave her a choice. "I will never trap you," Gideon continued, "but I refuse to let you walk into a war zone unprotected. The guards stay out of your way. They keep the perimeter clear. If you hate it, I will pull them back, but I am asking you to let me shield you." She picked up her ledger and pressed it against her chest. She hated the feeling of being watched, but she understood the tactical reality of a rogue threat. Gideon offered transparency, not manipulation. "They stay outside," Ivy negotiated. They do not report my business meetings to you. They only step in if the rival faction attacks." "Agreed," Gideon said. The tension left his shoulders. He reached out, his knuckles brushing the edge of her desk. "Since we established the terms of your security, let me negotiate a dinner. Tonight. Just us. No ledgers, no invoices." Ivy looked at the steady assurance in his posture. The dread of the looming war receded, replaced by a flutter of genuine anticipation. 8 o'clock. Ivy accepted. Chapter 14. Gas lamps flickered along the cobblestone streets of the historic district. Ivy walked beside Gideon, the cool evening air rustling the leaves above them. They stepped out of an upscale human steakhouse. Gideon paid the $200 bill without hesitation, leaving a generous tip on the table. The district offered a rare slice of peace within the city limits. Pedestrians strolled past ancient brick storefronts. A distant saxophone player filled the air with a smooth, lingering melody. Gideon guided her toward a wrought iron bench overlooking the Riverwalk. He moved with a relaxed grace, keeping himself positioned between Ivy and the street. He gave her his undivided attention throughout the entire meal. He asked about her childhood, her favorite authors, and her business expansion plans. He did not check his phone once. "You are quiet," Gideon observed. He sat next to her on the bench, leaving a respectful gap between them. Ivy twisted the silver ring on her left hand. "I am recalibrating. I expected an interrogation about pack politics or a lecture on werewolf history. You just wanted to know if I preferred acoustic or classical music." "I deal with politics all day," Gideon said. He rested his arm along the back of the bench. "When I am with you, I just want to be a man sitting next to a beautiful woman. I rule a territory of lethal predators, yet asking this woman for a kiss makes my pulse race like an untested recruit." His inner wolf let out an impatient growl in his mind. "Enough talking," the beast pushed. "Take the mate. Claim her now. Show the city she belongs to us." Gideon tightened his grip on the iron bench. He blocked the wolf's demands. He refused to let animal instinct ruin a perfect evening. Ivy turned her head. The gaslight caught the sharp angles of his face. She felt the nerves fluttering in her stomach, but fear no longer fueled them. The hesitation melted away. He proved his honesty. He respected her business, her boundaries, and her safety. She closed the gap. Gideon went still. Ivy reached up, resting her palm against his chest. She felt the rapid, booming rhythm of his heart beneath his shirt. She leaned in. Gideon caught his breath. He brought his hand up, his fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of her neck. He closed the remaining distance. The kiss started tentative, a silent question. Ivy answered by pressing closer. The world around them vanished. The kiss deepened, shifting from a polite inquiry into a grounding promise. Gideon treated her with desperate reverence. He did not rush. He poured every ounce of his unsaid devotion into the moment. When they pulled apart, Ivy rested her forehead against his chin. She let out a shaky breath. "We should get to the car," Gideon murmured, his voice rough. Ivy nodded, a warm look lifting her features. They stood up together, his hand wrapped tight around hers as they walked toward the parking area, stepping over the line between business and courtship. Chapter 15. The parking lot sat 2 blocks away, separated from the main promenade by a narrow, shadowed alleyway. Brick walls rose high on both sides. Dumpsters lined the cracked pavement, blocking the glow of the street lamps. Gideon stopped halfway down the passage. He released Ivy's hand, his heightened senses flaring. He had ordered his shadow detail to hold a 3-block perimeter to give them privacy for the evening, a tactical error that now tasted like ash. His inner wolf roared, a sound of pure violence echoing in his skull. "Enemies! Blood and teeth! Protect the mate!" From the shadows ahead, a figure stepped into the dim light. Darius stood blocking the exit. The scarred tissue on his cheek twisted into a cruel smile. He reached behind his back and pulled a long, wicked knife from a leather sheath. The hilt featured a wrapped leather grip. "You brought a fragile bird to my side of the river," Darius mocked. His voice scraped like gravel. Behind them, the entrance to the alley filled with movement. 12 shattered bone rogues stepped out of the dark, cutting off their escape. The air grew thick with hostile intent. Gideon shoved Ivy behind his back. "Stay against the wall. Do not run." Ivy pressed her spine against the cold brick. Panic flared, but she locked her knees, refusing to collapse. "Fear screams at me to flee, but loyalty anchors my feet to this concrete." "Take the Ironwood King," Darius ordered his pack. "Leave the Omega for me." Gideon did not hesitate. He let his inner beast loose. The shift hit him in a brutal, split-second wave. His bones snapped and lengthened with sickening cracks. Muscle tore and rebuilt itself. His clothes shredded into useless rags. In less than a heartbeat, an enormous, monstrous wolf stood in his place. Dark fur covered his giant frame. His jaws parted, revealing rows of lethal teeth. The first shattered bone rogue lunged. Gideon met the attack with savage force. He caught the enemy mid-air, his jaws locking around the wolf's throat. A sickening crunch echoed in the alley. Gideon tossed the broken body aside. 2 more attackers rushed his flanks. Gideon spun, a blur of muscle and rage. He swiped a heavy paw, his claws tearing through the chest of the second wolf. The third tried to bite his hind leg. Gideon kicked backward, launching the attacker into a brick wall. The enemy crumbled, unconscious. Darius watched his soldiers fall. He did not panic. He stepped forward, raising the blade. The unnatural shine of the metal caught the sparse light. Gideon let out a bone-chilling roar and charged the rival leader. He aimed for Darius's chest, ready to end the threat. Darius ducked low. He swung the knife in a wide, vicious arc, aiming for the Ironwood Alpha's blind spot. Chapter 16. The blade sliced through Gideon's side. A horrific sizzle filled the air, followed by the stench of burning flesh. Silver poison flooded Gideon's veins. The giant beast faltered, a harsh shout of raw agony ripping from his throat. He crashed onto the pavement, his giant frame convulsing as the toxic metal burned through his system. "Gideon!" Ivy screamed. Darius stood over the fallen Alpha. He kicked Gideon in the ribs. The Ironwood King tried to rise, his claws scraping useless paths into the asphalt, but the silver paralyzed his muscles. Dark blood pooled on the ground beneath him. "I told you," Darius gloated, pointing the blade at Gideon's face. "Your attachments make you weak." Another shattered bone rogue stepped forward, eyeing Ivy. The beast bared its teeth, stepping closer to the brick wall. Ivy scanned the alley. She needed a weapon, but the cracked pavement offered nothing. She looked at the advancing rogue, then at Gideon's bleeding form. She spent her entire adult life avoiding violence, suppressing her wolf to blend into human society. She refused to watch the man she loved die. "My peaceful nature ends tonight. Nobody touches my partner." Ivy planted her feet. She pushed past the mental barriers and called on her own inner beast. The shift tore through her system. Her silk blouse and slacks ripped apart as her bones snapped and reformed. The pain bit deep, a searing heat rushing through her blood. In seconds, she transformed. She did not possess the giant, muscular bulk of an alpha. She stood as a lithe, agile Omega wolf with a coat of pale golden fur. The advancing rogue paused, shocked by the sudden transformation. Omegas rarely fought. They healed. They calmed. Ivy did not offer calm. She lunged. She utilized her speed, dodging the rogue's snapping jaws. She clamped her teeth around the enemy's front leg and bit down with every ounce of strength she possessed. The bone gave way with a sharp crack. The rogue yelped, its leg buckling inward. The beast crashed onto the pavement, tumbling into a pile of discarded cardboard. Darius whipped his head around, stunned by the Omega's defiance. He took a step toward her, raising the silver blade. "You stupid, fragile little pet." Ivy did not retreat. She stood over the whimpering rogue, placing her lithe body between Darius and Gideon's bleeding form. She bared her fangs, a low, warning growl vibrating in her chest. Gideon lay on the pavement behind her, his vision blurred. The silver fire consumed his nerves. "Mate fights," his fading inner wolf whimpered in his mind. "Mate defends the den. Do not die. Get up!" Darius snarled. He lunged forward, bringing the silver knife down in a lethal strike. Ivy braced herself, ready to intercept the poisoned metal with her own body. Before the blade could connect, a savage roar shook the alleyway. Heavy footsteps pounded against the pavement. Lucian and a squad of loyal Ironwood enforcers surged into the narrow space, charging straight for the enemy leader. Chapter 17. The narrow passage erupted into pure, unbridled chaos. Lucian led the Ironwood fighters, hitting the enemy line with the unstoppable force of a freight train. The beta blurred mid-stride, his human form ripping apart. He hit the cracked pavement as a lean timber wolf, snapping his powerful jaws around the shoulder of an incoming rogue. The invader thrashed against the asphalt, but Lucian pinned the enemy flat. Behind the beta, a dozen Ironwood defenders collided with the shattered bone forces. The sounds of brutal combat, snapping jaws, tearing fabric, and heavy impacts against the brick walls filled the dark space. Ivy held her ground over Gideon's bleeding body. In her pale golden wolf form, she kept her fangs bared. A desperate rogue, fleeing the wrath of the enforcers, altered his path and lunged straight for her. Ivy twisted her agile frame, attempting to dodge the strike. The rogue's sharp claws caught her flank, tearing through her fur and skin. A hot, stinging fire flared along her ribs. She ignored the fresh injury. She snapped her jaws, catching the attacker's ear and forcing the enemy backward into the waiting grip of an Ironwood soldier. This concrete alley will not become a graveyard for the man I love. Darius realized the shift in power. The rival leader backed away, his gaze darting toward the street exit. He slashed the silver-laced blade in a wild arc to create space, preparing to abandon his pack and run. He never made it. Lucian abandoned his previous target and launched himself across a discarded wooden crate. The Timberwolf slammed into Darius's chest, taking the rival down to the pavement. The poisoned weapon clattered across the ground, spinning away into the shadows. Lucian planted his heavy paws against the enemy's sternum, issuing a low, vibrating growl of warning an inch from the invader's throat. A nearby enforcer immediately scooped the toxic blade up, securing the lethal evidence before it could poison the human streets. The fight ended in under 3 minutes. The remaining rogues surrendered, dropping to their bellies in submission. The immediate threat neutralized, Ivy forced the brutal transition back to her human body. The shift tore through her system, snapping her bones back into their original alignment. She collapsed onto her hands and knees on the cold asphalt. Without her ruined clothes, the night air bit at her bare skin. She shivered, her side throbbing from the bleeding scratch. A young enforcer averted his eyes, stripping off his heavy fleece jacket and offering the garment. Ivy snatched the fabric, wrapping it tight around her shoulders to cover herself. Behind her, Gideon forced his own transition. The sound of his shifting bones echoed in the sudden quiet of the alley. His giant beast shrank, reforming the broad, muscular human frame she recognized. He collapsed onto his back, his chest rising in shallow, erratic gasps. The transformation left his clothes in ruined shreds. Dark blood soaked the remnants of his shirt, pooling from the deep, sizzling gash in his side. Ivy dropped to her knees beside him. The concrete scraped her skin, but she ignored the sting. She pressed her hands over the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. The silver burn radiated an unnatural, toxic heat. "Stay awake," Ivy ordered, her voice cracking under the strain. "Look at me! Do not close your eyes!" Gideon groaned, his head rolling toward her. His strong features contorted in pure agony. He reached up with a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the fleece of her borrowed jacket to assure himself she survived the clash. Lucian shifted back to his human form. The beta stood over Darius, securing heavy iron cuffs around the rival's wrists. The metal clicked shut with a definitive snap. "Drag him to the compound cells," Lucian commanded his men. He turned his attention to his fallen alpha. The beta crouched next to Ivy, taking in the extent of the damage. "The silver is in his bloodstream. The paralysis is spreading. We need the healers right now." Tires screeched at the end of the alley. A black medical transport van reversed into the narrow space, its rear doors swinging open. 2 Ironwood medics rushed out with a rolling stretcher. Ivy kept the pressure on Gideon's side, her hands stained crimson. She refused to move away, marching alongside the stretcher as they loaded the bleeding warlord into the back of the waiting vehicle, leaving the ruined alleyway behind. Chapter 18. Harsh fluorescent lights beat down on the sterile white tiles of the Ironwood infirmary. The room offered a stark contrast to the dark, bloody alley. Stainless steel counters lined the walls, stocked with medical supplies and traditional herbal jars. Ivy paced the length of the room, tracking the lines in the floor. She wore a set of borrowed blue medical scrubs, the fabric hanging loose over her frame. A nurse treated the scratch on her flank minutes ago, binding the minor wound in neat white gauze, but the physical relief offered zero mental comfort. In the center of the room, Gideon lay on a steel medical table. His shredded garments were cut away, replaced by a simple hospital sheet draped over his waist. Fiona, the senior pack healer, stood over him. She worked with frantic, practiced speed. "Hold him steady," Fiona instructed 2 burly enforcers positioned at the head of the table. Fiona held a ceramic bowl filled with a thick purple paste. Traditional folklore dictated the brutal cure for silver poisoning. Wolfsbane, a lethal toxin under normal circumstances, acted as a magnet for the corrupted metal. The healer scooped a generous amount of the crushed flour paste onto a sterile pad. She pressed the poultice hard into the raw, blistering gash on Gideon's side. Gideon surged upward against the restraints. A harsh shout tore from his throat, echoing off the tile walls. The enforcers shoved his shoulders back down, pinning him to the steel surface. The chemical reaction between the wolfsbane and the silver produced a violent hiss. Dark, corrupted blood bubbled to the surface, drawn out by the abrasive herbal remedy. Ivy stopped pacing. She gripped the edge of a metal supply cart, her knuckles turning stark white. She hated watching him suffer, but she refused to look away. She demanded accountability in all things, including bearing witness to the consequences of a war fought in her defense. He treats his own life as a disposable shield, ignoring the wreckage his death would leave behind. Fiona wiped the toxic runoff away and applied a fresh layer of the purple paste. She repeated the agonizing process 3 times until the blood ran clear. Finally, she wrapped a thick, clean bandage around Gideon's midsection. "The poison is out," Fiona announced, stripping off her latex gloves and tossing them into a bin. "His fast healing will handle the rest. He just needs sleep and caloric fuel." The enforcers relaxed their hold. They filed out of the room, leaving Ivy alone with the alpha. Gideon lay still for a long time. His skin looked pale, covered in a sheen of cold sweat. The monitor beside his bed beeped in a steady, rhythmic cadence. He turned his head on the thin pillow, focusing his intense stare on Ivy. He pushed himself up onto his elbows. The movement strained his fresh bandages, but he ignored the pain. "You need to leave the territory," Gideon rasped. His voice sounded dry and hollow. "Pack your bags. Lucian will arrange a secure flight out of the region." Ivy stared at him, stunned by the sudden demand. "What are you talking about?" "Darius brought a blade meant for me," Gideon continued, forcing the words out through clenched teeth. "Next time, the enemy brings a blade for you. I cannot let you stay in Verdant Heights. The danger is too close. You have to run." He looked away, his jaw tight. He offered a final sacrifice, pushing away the partner he craved to ensure her survival. He waited for her to agree, expecting her to turn around and walk out the door. Ivy let go of the metal cart and walked straight toward his bed, her posture radiating an unyielding, fierce resolve. Chapter 19. Ivy stopped inches from the steel table. She did not raise her voice, but her tone carried the weight of an anvil. "I am not going anywhere," Ivy stated. Gideon dragged his gaze back to her. The monitor beside him spiked, his heart rate jumping. "You do not understand faction warfare. This is not a boardroom negotiation. They will hunt you to break my focus." "I understand bullies," Ivy countered. She planted her hands on her hips, her borrowed scrubs billowing around her frame. "And I understand cowards. You think pushing me away makes you noble. It just makes you a martyr. We sat in my shop and talked about facing problems. You demanded I stop building walls." "This is different," Gideon argued. He swung his legs over the side of the table, ignoring the sharp pull of his bandaged side. "I brought violence to your front door. I pulled you into a nightmare." His inner wolf thrashed inside his skull, rejecting the human logic. "Claim the mate," the beast ordered. "She fights for the den. She stays. Anchor her to us." Gideon clenched his fists, fighting a two-front war against his own beast and the woman standing before him. "I will not let you die because of my title. I survived decades of brutal combat, yet this fierce woman scolding me in a hospital room brings me to my knees." Ivy reached out. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to meet her gaze. She did not shrink back from the intensity in his expression. "You do not get to dictate my limits. I stood in that alley. I took a hit to protect you. I chose to stay." Gideon stopped fighting. The frantic pacing of his inner wolf halted, replaced by a deep, resounding agreement. "My ex controlled me by deciding what was best for my safety," Ivy continued, her thumb brushing against his jaw. "I told you I require a partner, not a manager. If we are doing this, we do it together. I anchor you, you shield me. No running." Gideon stared at her, the last of his resistance crumbling into dust. The exhaustion and the pain faded into the background. She demanded an equal share of his burdens. She claimed her place at his side without hesitation, proving her loyalty ran deeper than any primal instinct. He turned his head, pressing a kiss against the palm of her hand. "You are impossible." "I am holding you accountable," Ivy corrected. She lowered her hand, the sharp edge of her anger melting into gentle affection. "Now lie back down before you tear that wound back open." A rough, genuine sound of amusement escaped Gideon's throat. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tight against his side. He leaned back onto the thin pillow, his muscles finally relaxing. The war outside the walls remained, but the battle inside the infirmary was over. "Lucian locked Darius in the lower levels," Gideon said, staring at the ceiling tiles. "I have to deal with him." "Sleep first," Ivy ordered. She pulled a plastic chair up to the side of the bed and sat down, crossing her legs. "The dungeon can wait until morning. The rogue is not going anywhere." Gideon closed his eyes, drawing comfort from her proximity. He fell into a deep sleep, anchored by the resolute, unyielding partner who refused to retreat from the storm. Chapter 20. The lower levels of the Ironwood compound consisted of thick concrete and iron bars. The air down here felt damp and cold, a stark contrast to the comfortable warmth of the main house above. Gideon walked down the long corridor. He wore a clean, dark t-shirt that concealed the heavy bandages wrapped around his ribs. His body ached with every measured step, but he buried the pain deep. He required unquestioned authority for this task. Lucian stood outside the last cell on the block. The beta held a clipboard, his expression rigid and focused. "The prisoner is awake," Lucian reported, stepping aside. Gideon approached the bars. Inside the cell, Darius sat on a wooden bench. Heavy iron chains bound the rival leader's wrists and ankles, bolted to the concrete floor. The burn mark on his cheek flushed a furious red. Darius looked up as Gideon stopped in front of the cage. "You look terrible," Darius taunted. The gravel in his voice echoed off the bare walls. "The poison slows you down. A few more inches and your pack would be looking for a new boss." Gideon rested his hands on the iron bars. He did not lose his temper. He let a long, heavy silence stretch between them, allowing the weight of his presence to suffocate the prisoner. "You crossed my borders," Gideon stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "You placed traps meant to maim my people. You brought a poisoned blade into neutral territory." "I brought a war," Darius spat. He leaned forward, the chains clanking against the floor. "And you brought a pet. How long until your fragile Omega breaks? How long until she realizes you are just an animal wearing a suit?" "A rabid dog only understands the strike of a heavy boot." "She stood her ground against you," Gideon countered, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "She shattered your soldier's leg to defend her territory. She is not a pet. She is my partner." Darius glared, the taunt failing to land its mark. The rival realized his mind games were useless. Gideon pulled a set of keys from his pocket. He tossed them to Lucian. "Gather the enforcers. Send a messenger to the Shattered Bone territory. Tell their second-in-command that Darius broke the treaties." "What is the judgment?" Lucian asked, catching the ring. Gideon looked back at the prisoner. Cold, sharp justice settled over his features. "He brought silver. He forfeits his title and his life. The execution happens at dawn. Let the surviving rogues watch. Let the entire region know what happens when you threaten my people." Darius lunged forward, but the chains snapped taut, jerking him back to the bench. "You cannot kill an alpha in a cage. Fight me in the clearing. Fight me like a wolf." "You fought like a coward in an alley," Gideon dismissed. He turned his back on the screaming prisoner. He had no desire to entertain a defeated enemy. Gideon walked back down the concrete hallway, leaving the noise of the dungeon behind. He climbed the stairs toward the main floor of the compound. The adrenaline from the interrogation faded, replaced by a deep, pulling need to find Ivy. He secured his territory. He issued his warnings. Now, he just wanted to go home. Chapter 21. The heavy oak door of the Alpha's private quarters clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the compound. The room offered a vast, quiet sanctuary. A traditional stone hearth dominated the far wall, where thick logs cracked and popped, sending bright sparks into the chimney. Gideon leaned his back against the timber doorframe, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Ivy sat on the edge of the sprawling mattress. She watched him, cataloging the exhaustion dragging at his posture. He still wore the dark t-shirt from the dungeon, moving with a stiff, careful caution to protect the tender, healing flesh along his ribs. He walked across the woven rug. Every step required calculated effort. Gideon sank onto the mattress beside her, letting out a long, ragged breath. He rested his elbows on his knees, staring at the dancing flames in the hearth. The adrenaline crash hit them both at the same time, draining the lingering fight-or-flight instincts from their veins and leaving an aching vulnerability in its wake. "Lucian sent a messenger to the enemy territory," Gideon stated, his voice a low rumble. "The threat is neutralized. You are safe." "I know," Ivy replied. She shifted closer, letting her leg press against his thigh. His skin radiated an intense, comforting heat. Gideon turned his head to look at her. The shadows of the firelight highlighted the lingering tension around his eyes. He lifted his hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I watched that blade swing toward you in the alley. For 3 seconds, my heart stopped beating. I thought I lost you." "The terrifying warlord in the dungeon is just a man who needs a safe place to rest." "I am right here," Ivy whispered. She lifted her hands, framing his face. Her thumbs traced the prominent bones of his cheeks. She poured all her unsaid devotion into the touch, quiet and steady, demanding he focus on the present. A ragged sigh escaped Gideon's throat. He turned his face, pressing a kiss to the palm of her hand. The protective restraint he kept in place for weeks shattered. He wrapped his arms around her waist and pulled her flush against his chest. Ivy gasped at the sudden contact, but she welcomed the grounding weight of his embrace. She looped her arms around his neck, anchoring herself to him. She guided him backward until they lay tangled together on the covers. She remained hyper-aware of his bandaged side, keeping her weight braced to avoid causing him any pain. Gideon rolled onto his back, pulling her over him. His hands mapped the curve of her spine, mapping her presence with desperate reverence. "Mate is in the den," his inner wolf rumbled in his mind, the beast purring with primal satisfaction. "Claim her. Keep her." For the first time, Gideon did not fight the beast. He agreed. He tilted her chin up, capturing her lips. The kiss carried no hesitation. It held the frantic, consuming energy of two people who almost lost everything. Ivy answered his demand with equal fervor. She tangled her fingers into his hair, pulling him closer. The heat between them ignited into a searing fire, burning away the remaining shadows of the night. Gideon broke the kiss, his breathing ragged. He trailed his lips down her jaw, pressing open-mouthed kisses along the sensitive skin of her neck. Ivy let out a soft sound of approval. She arched into his touch, her hands sliding under the hem of his cotton shirt. She felt the rigid, corded muscle of his abdomen, avoiding the thick gauze wrapped around his ribs. He moved his hands down to the hem of her borrowed scrubs, waiting for her silent permission. Ivy lifted her arms, allowing him to pull the fabric away. He tossed the garment onto the floor. Gideon looked at her, his expression filled with an unwavering adoration that stripped away all her hidden loneliness. She surrendered her guarded heart. There were no walls left to maintain. She guided him back down, initiating a slow, intoxicating exploration of their connection. They spent the remaining hours of the night mapping every inch of each other. They sealed their bond with whispered promises and the undeniable proof of their shared devotion, finding ultimate peace within the safety of the locked room. They recognized the irrefutable truth in their intertwined souls. They were true mates, bound together for the rest of their lives. Chapter 22. 3 weeks later, the east wing of the Ironwood compound buzzed with chaotic, productive energy. The newly renovated space served as the permanent headquarters for the administrative side of Ivy's bookstore and cafe. Glass-walled offices replaced old storage rooms. Sleek, modern desks lined the main floor, creating a bright, professional environment right in the center of shifter territory. Ivy stood at the head of the conference table, checking names off a digital manifest on her screen. Her human assistant, a young college graduate named Maya, hovered near the water cooler, clutching a stack of printed itineraries like a shield. "The floral delivery is delayed by 30 minutes, Ivy announced, looking up from her device. "Call the vendor and demand an updated arrival time. We have a strict deadline for the ballroom setup." Maya nodded, but her attention darted toward the hallway. "I will call them right now. Ivy, is it safe to go out there?" Ivy followed her assistant's gaze. A burly enforcer named Garrett leaned against the wall near the exit. Garrett possessed arms the size of tree trunks and a permanent, intimidating scowl. He wore the standard dark tactical gear of the pack defenders. To a human, he looked like a lethal threat waiting to strike. "Garrett is harmless," Ivy assured her, fighting a knowing smile. "He looks like he eats metal for breakfast," Maya whispered. Before Ivy could respond, a demanding yowl echoed from the top of the nearby filing cabinet. The fluffy orange feline stood up, stretching his long body. Macaroni jumped down from his perch, landing on the floor with a heavy thud. The cat trotted straight toward the doorway, his tail held high like a royal banner. Garrett dropped his intimidating scowl. The giant enforcer knelt on the hardwood floor, reaching into one of his tactical pouches. He pulled out a small, foil-sealed tin. "I brought the good stuff today, Your Majesty," Garrett muttered, peeling the lid back to reveal premium albacore tuna. Macaroni purred, winding his fluffy body around the enforcer's combat boots. Garrett set the tin down and offered the cat a gentle scratch behind the ears. Maya stared at the interaction, her jaw dropping open in utter disbelief. "Go make the phone call, Maya," Ivy instructed, hiding a smile. Maya hurried past the distracted guard without another word. Ivy picked up her coffee cup and walked toward the doorway. Gideon stood in the hall, watching the scene unfold. He wore a simple black button-down shirt that hugged his broad shoulders. The silver wound on his side was a faded scar, leaving him back at his peak strength. "You are ruining the fearsome reputation of my soldiers," Gideon noted, stepping into her office. "My elite warriors survived decades of brutal combat, only to be subjugated by an overgrown house pet." "I did nothing," Ivy countered, taking a sip of her dark roast. "Your warriors formed an alliance with the cat behind my back. It seems the Ironwood Pack has a weakness for strays." Gideon stepped close, invading her personal space. He reached out and snagged her coffee cup, taking a sip for himself. "I have a weakness for brilliant women who orchestrate corporate takeovers from my guest wing. The pack just follows my lead." Ivy took her cup back, a warm, unguarded look lifting her features. Integrating her human staff into a werewolf compound carried a steep learning curve, but the results proved phenomenal. The pack members respected her boundaries, and her staff slowly learned the terrifying shifters were protective of their community. "The Verdant Heights Book Fair starts tomorrow," Ivy reminded him, bringing her focus back to the impending deadline. 300 guests, 5 corporate sponsors. I need everything to run like clockwork." "It will," Gideon promised. He ran a hand down her arm, his touch grounding and warm. "I placed Lucian in charge of the exterior security detail. No one gets near the venue without an invitation. You focus on the event. I will handle the perimeter." "A true partnership," Ivy agreed. She set her cup down on a nearby desk and leaned into him. Gideon caught her waist, pulling her into a brief, thorough kiss that sent a familiar thrill down her spine. The sound of macaroni crunching his premium snacks filled the silence, a bizarre but comforting soundtrack to their new reality. They forged a life that blended their two fractured worlds into something stronger, proving a little patience and a lot of tuna could bridge any divide. Chapter 23. The Verdant Heights Community Center buzzed with vibrant energy. The grand exhibition hall featured vaulted ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the town square, and rows of pristine, decorated tables. Guests mingled over premium coffee and pastries, browsing the vast selection of novels, biographies, and local art. Ivy stood near the main stage, coordinating the final author panel presentation. She wore an elegant, tailored plum dress that commanded attention without sacrificing professionalism. She tapped her screen, verifying the audio cues with the sound engineer in the back booth. "The mayor goes on in 5 minutes," Ivy instructed through her headset. "Cue the introductory graphics on screen 3. "Copy that," the engineer replied over the radio. A sudden crash echoed from the far side of the hall. Ivy lowered the microphone and turned her head. A careless vendor had knocked over a tall stack of hardcovers, sending the inventory spilling across the polished floor and blocking the main aisle. Ivy did not panic. She marched across the room, her flats clicking against the floorboards. She knelt beside the flustered vendor, helping him gather the scattered novels and restack them onto a sturdy wooden pallet. Within 2 minutes, the aisle was clear and the crisis was averted. A deep sense of triumph bloomed in her chest. The event ran without a single flaw. Her human staff operated in seamless tandem with the venue personnel. She looked across the crowded room, her gaze searching for the one person who made the evening possible. Gideon stood near the arched entrance. He wore a custom dark indigo tuxedo that emphasized his imposing height. He held a glass of bourbon, watching the crowd with the calculating gaze of a warlord surveying his territory. Several corporate executives attempted to engage him in conversation, but his attention remained fixed on Ivy. "The territory is secure," his inner wolf noted, a satisfied purr vibrating in his mind. "The mate provides for the den. We guard the doors." Gideon took a slow sip of his bourbon. "She commands this room. Let them look. She chose us." Ivy finished her final check and navigated through the sea of readers to reach him. Gideon stepped forward to meet her, intercepting her path with practiced ease. He handed her a fresh glass of sparkling water, anticipating her exact needs. "You look like you are plotting a hostile takeover," Ivy teased, accepting the drink. "I am calculating the fastest exit route," Gideon corrected. He leaned close, keeping his voice pitched low so only she could hear. "The event is a monumental success. You conquered the literary sector. Now I want to steal you away from these people." "The night is still young," Ivy reminded him, though the idea held undeniable appeal. She took a long drink of the cold water. "But I think we can slip out after the mayor's speech concludes. My staff has the breakdown protocols handled." "I built this empire with my own hands, but having a vanguard standing by my side makes the victory sweeter." The mayor of Verdant Heights walked onto the main stage. The lights dimmed, and the crowd fell silent. The politician tapped the microphone, his voice booming through the hall. "Before we begin," the mayor announced, "I want to extend a formal thank you to the brilliant coordinator of tonight's fair. Ivy, your agency delivered an unprecedented experience. We look forward to a long, lucrative partnership." The room erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Several investors turned toward Ivy, raising their glasses in acknowledgement. Ivy felt a sudden rush of heat to her cheeks. She offered a gracious nod to the crowd, accepting the praise with the poise of a seasoned professional. She achieved her goal. She built a self-sustaining empire, proving her worth to the business world on her own terms. Gideon set his bourbon glass onto a passing waiter's tray. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers in a public display of solidarity. He did not boast or claim credit for her achievement. He stood as her silent, unwavering pillar of support. "I believe your work here is done," Gideon murmured. "Yes," Ivy agreed, her heart soaring. "It is." They turned away from the main presentation, walking out of the grand exhibition hall together. The cool night air of the city hit them as they exited the building. They did not need a shadow detail or a pack of enforcers tonight. The threat of rival alphas lay buried in the past. They walked toward the parking garage, ready to return to the quiet sanctuary of the Ironwood compound, their shared future stretching out before them, bright and unwritten. Chapter 24. The midnight quiet of the Ironwood packhouse offered a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the book fair. Baby and Gideon bypassed the main living areas and walked straight into his private executive office. The room felt heavy with the quiet peace of the late hour. Ivy kicked off her dress shoes, letting them fall onto the woven rug. She walked over to the sprawling leather sofa and collapsed into the cushions with a sigh of relief. The adrenaline of the long week finally caught up to her, settling deep into her muscles. "We need a vacation," Ivy announced, staring up at the ceiling beams. "Somewhere with no Wi-Fi and no inventory catalogs." Gideon walked behind his sleek glass desk. He unbuttoned the collar of his indigo tuxedo shirt, discarding the restrictive tie onto the glass surface. "I can arrange a cabin in the northern mountains. No cell service, just snow and trees." "Make it happen," Ivy ordered, her eyes sliding shut. Gideon smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He reached out to open his top desk drawer, intending to put away his steel fountain pen. A strange, rhythmic crunching sound echoed from the corner of the room. Gideon turned his head. Macaroni sat near the potted fern, chewing on a piece of jagged metal. The cat batted the object with a fluffy paw, sending it skittering across the hardwood floor. Gideon walked over and scooped the discarded toy up with his bare hand. It was the heavy iron crest of the shattered bone pack, stripped from Darius after his execution. The fearsome war trophy now bore the distinct bite marks of a very spoiled Persian cat. "Your beast has expensive taste," Gideon noted, tossing the ruined crest into the trash bin. "He is an apex predator," Ivy mumbled from the sofa, keeping her eyes closed. "Do not mock his hunting skills." Gideon chuckled, returning to his desk. He opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a crisp, pristine object. He walked around the glass structure and stopped in front of the leather sofa. Ivy opened one eye, watching him hold the item out toward her. It was a brand new, uncreased copy of the paperback romance novel he destroyed on the day they met. "I believe we have an outstanding ledger," Gideon said, his voice laced with rich amusement. Ivy sat up, recognizing the familiar cover art. A bright laugh escaped her chest. She reached out and took the book from his fingers, tracing the unbroken spine. "I told you, I demand strict replacement policies. You missed the Friday deadline by a whole month." "You charged me a $40 inconvenience fee," Gideon reminded her, sitting down on the sofa beside her. He rested his arm along the back of the cushions. "And you refused to accept my extra cash. You demanded strict accountability." Ivy looked at the pristine novel. She remembered the sheer terror and indignation that fueled her during that initial confrontation. She sat in her shop demanding accountability from a feral warlord, expecting to be thrown out or threatened. Instead, she found a man desperate for an equal. She turned the book over in her hands, meeting his gaze. The teasing spark in his eyes held a depth of emotion that anchored her soul. He was offering her everything, his resources, his protection, his heart, without any strings attached. He ruined a fictional romance to get my attention and gave me a reality better than any story. Ivy placed the book onto the coffee table. She turned her body, tucking her legs beneath her, and rested her head against his broad shoulder. "The debt is settled," Ivy declared, wrapping her arms around his torso. "We are finally even." A deep, vibrating chuckle rumbled in Gideon's chest. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her tight against his side. "You drove a hard bargain, Omega." "You drove a hard bargain, Omega." "I am a very effective negotiator," Ivy agreed, closing her eyes again, breathing in the crisp, woody aroma lingering on his skin. They sat together in the quiet office, the new book resting on the table as a monument to their chaotic beginning. They survived ruined chapters, rival ambushes, and the heavy burden of pack politics. In the end, the ledgers did not matter. They built an unbreakable partnership founded on mutual respect, fierce loyalty, and a love that defied all logic, proving that their true worth could never be measured in numbers. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.